This is the fourth in our series on George Grant, the Owl, and JADIS. In this particular section, we're going to look at Grant in Athens, the classical condition and the contemplative way. There's a tendency within the West, and as I mentioned in the previous one on Judaism, to be quite illiterate, and amnesia tends to dominate significant elements of the modern and postmodern world. So when even people turn to the past, they very much go cherry picking, and they usually have a very thin and shallow understanding of the classical civilization. Grant was very, very much interested in the Greek tradition, and particularly the tradition of Plato, with secondary interest in Aristotle, as a reply to the dilemmas that was raised within the Jewish tradition, in particular biblical Judaism. For within biblical Judaism, as I mentioned previously, there is this tension between the God who wills, the God who chooses, the God who acts, but is that God good, and the God who is good and from which will is a byproduct. And so within this dilemma of biblical Judaism, which was seen as a revelatory tradition, and for many a revelatory tradition, as you get in certain elements of Islam, you can't question it. God has inspired the text is received, and we merely reflect upon and devotionally interpret and internalize the meaning of that text. But when we bring critical faculties to the text, we face serious difficulties. So Grant found in the revelatory tradition of biblical Judaism these dilemmas. Which God is at work? Which God is speaking, I have chosen you, I command people to do things, thus saith the Lord. And he was dissatisfied largely with significant elements of the God of war in the Old Testament, and how will seemed to trump goodness. So he turns to Plato and the Greek tradition, because in Plato, of course, he's facing exactly the same thing when he reads Homer or Hesiod. You have the gods who are violent, the gods who are warlike, the gods who often are more immoral than humans. And so Plato is grappling with, so what is the divine like? Is the divine sheer will, choosing, or is goodness at the heart of ultimate reality? And so in Plato, and also in Aristotle for that matter, we get the argument that goodness is at the very core of ultimate reality, and the nature of philosophy then, of thinking, is this longing for the good, to know the good, to experience the good. So the second element of why Grant turned to Plato and Aristotle was not only the reflection on who is God, what is ultimate reality like, does will dominate goodness or goodness will, but also philosophy had become very much captivated by a form of narrow scientism and rationalism, and also Western culture had become this driven, almost Jadis-like, faster, faster, faster. Within the Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle, the contemplative way of knowing and being is the very highest way of understanding the role of mind, understood as nous, as a mystical faculty that brought together imagination and thinking. And so the task for Grant as a philosopher, why he turned to the Greeks in a highly driven, rationalistic, scientific Western world, he saw in them a mother lode of wisdom that we could turn to once again in terms of living into the vita contemplativa. And almost prophetic-like, he railed against the addiction to the vita activa in the West and a hyper-rationalism, and called people back to the vita contemplativa, so well embodied, so well thought through in Plato and Aristotle. And so you get this almost metanoia, this calling for repentance in the West from its addiction to the vita activa. So for Grant, the turn to the Greeks was in a sense an antidote to the toxins of modernity, in which people had been totally absorbed and immersed in an extreme form of rationalism, scientism, and then this hyper-driven activists. And so by turning to that classical civilization, it was a way of saying no to some of the distortions and aberrations of the modern and postmodern way, and its uncritical attachment to the vita activa.